To this PKF Francis Clark deep dive webinar on net zero. So today, really, we're just looking at what this means, understanding why it's important, because it's been covered, quite a lot in the press, and the government have certain views of it. We're also going to just look at how it's relevant to us as individuals and businesses in general. So we've got, three people here on the panel, and we're just going to be posing questions to them as their business leaders and experts in their own fields. So we've got about 45 minutes today. I think it's planned to run until 3:45. Obviously, we'll try and keep to that time if we can. If we're in the middle of some questions and things, then we may overrun slightly, but hopefully, you won't mind, and the content will be interesting. So. Really just starting off, if we just spend a few minutes just introducing the panel, and I'll let the panel here introduce themselves as we go around. But for me, my name's Kieran Hancock. I'm a director in Francis Clark, and I deal with medical practices. So that's GP practices, doctors, hospital consultants. And the reason I'm here today is that I am the leader of the green teams in Francis Clark. And what that means is each of our individual offices have individual teams who look after, recycling, trying to be more sustainable in each of the offices, and just introducing best practice and things that we can do as an office and as a firm to be more sustainable and try to be better for the environment. So that's me. I'll introduce the panel now, and I'll just go to John, if that's okay, to start off with you, and then we'll just move around to the others.
Yeah, my name's John Peters. I'm MD with SWIG Finance. We're a not-for-profit finance company based in Truro, offices in Exeter and Bristol. We provide finance and support to small businesses and startups throughout the region. So over the last year or so, I guess we've been working on our own sort of net zero strategy and plans, and now looking at sort of rolling that on to our customers and the small businesses that we support ourselves.
Okay, thanks, John. Scott?
Yeah, hi everyone, good to be on the panel. So I'm Scott James from Ward Williams Associates. We're construction and built environment consultants out of the southwest and across the UK. So we've got 7 offices, 150 staff, a real focus on driving carbon reduction in our business and across the businesses we work with. We're also the world's first chartered surveyors to become a B Corporation, and have just won the Queen's Award for Enterprise for Sustainable Development. So hopefully a bit of context that will be useful for today.
Yeah, no, thanks, Scott. And yeah, finally, Peter, if you could just introduce yourself, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. Hi all. Yeah, my name's Peter Lefort. I work for the University of Exeter. I run something called the Green Futures Network, which is a mechanism to increase access to the latest climate data, environmental research. One of the projects that I run is a community of practice for organisations across the southwest looking to better understand their scope 3 emissions, which I imagine we'll talk about a bit later. I'll just put a link to that in the chat, and that's open to anyone to join. But really good to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Something I haven't mentioned yet is there should be a Q&A function for everyone. So as we're going through asking questions to the panel, we're just going to be asking questions and hopefully trying to keep it relatively natural. If you've got questions, feel free to ask us in the Q&A section. It might be that we don't have time to cover all of those, but we have the ability to take those away, and we can make sure either me or one of the panel come back to you and with an answer if that's okay. So yeah, really, we'll just start asking some questions to the panel. We can just work out, go through what is net zero, what this means, and just look at how this has been impacting on each of the businesses that are here, and Peter from a slightly more technical side of things. So if I think I'll pose this first question to Peter, if that's okay. So would you just start talking, starting off with what is net zero and what that means, if that's okay?
Yeah, great. So net zero, well, I guess there's what it actually means and what it means when people talk about it, which is not always the same thing. Broad scale, it's at the moment sort of synonymous with any kind of environmental activity. A lot of businesses talk about net zero. People talk about net zero as meaning being aware of your environmental impact. What it practically means is we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, and are the amount of emissions we are creating equal to the amount that we are capturing or sequestering. And that's effectively what net zero means. You might also be familiar with terms like carbon neutral which was around for a little bit before net zero, and now we're sort of shifting into net zero. Carbon neutral is fairly intuitive, and similar things are the amount of carbon emissions we're creating equal to the amount that we're offsetting, capturing. And if we are, then we are carbon neutral. So we're working towards that goal. With net zero, there's much more behind it in terms of scientific rigor. It's more about the trajectory we take towards that point where we become net zero. And it's about specific reporting boundaries of how do we measure baseline boundary, the emissions that we're creating. But effectively, it's about reducing our emissions and getting as low as possible. And then with that last little bit, figuring out how we can capture carbon or carbon equivalent greenhouse gases in order to have a minimal impact and mitigate the potential impact of the climate emergency.
Yeah, okay. So when we talk about carbon neutral, we're just talking, that's literally CO2 and carbon emissions, and then net zero is, greenhouse gases as a whole. So I suppose, does that, that includes things like carbon dioxide, methane, all those different types of greenhouse gases then, does it?
Yeah, that's right. And often when people say carbon neutral, they mean carbon and carbon equivalents, which are the other greenhouse gases. So it's not always that clear cut, but generally, yes, net zero is much more explicitly about greenhouse gases as a whole, not just carbon emissions.
Yeah. Okay. No, thanks, Peter. That's really useful. So, are there, when we say net zero, I guess there's net zero as a country or a world or earth. Is there a net zero for businesses then? Is that a slightly different definition for what it might be?
Not technically, but then there's a bigger area in terms of we don't know exactly what that means for any scale of organization yet, because a lot of net zero targets are based on technology that hasn't been invented yet, for example, that is going to capture a lot of the carbon that we can't get rid of, we can't reduce. But for businesses, it's exactly the same principle. It's let's reduce our carbon and other greenhouse gases as much as we possibly can, and then look at that last little bit, which will vary depending on what kind of business we are, concrete industry or, steel sector. Maybe they're not going to be able to do what they do without emitting a certain amount of carbon. Other businesses, they might be able to get even closer to zero carbon. But everyone is going to have to go through, whether they're a business, a city, a country, are going to have to do some kind of work to offset or negative emissions to counterweight the emissions that they are creating.
Okay, on my screen, Peter, you were cutting out a little bit. I'm not sure if any of the panel was, if Peter was cutting out on theirs or whether it was just mine, but it seems like it was just mine. So I didn't hear most of what you said, but that's good. Hopefully it was, answered the question that I had. So no, that's fine. So just looking at, what, in terms of emissions, what emissions are and aren't included, do we just looking at everything, or are we just looking at some things in isolation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot to talk about there, which we can unpack. It'd be great to hear John and Scott's perspectives on this. Effectively, you can separate emissions into three categories or scopes. So there's scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And scope 1 emissions are the emissions that we directly create. So that might be our company vehicles, like the fuel we burn in order for our cars to do what they need to do for our company. Scope 2 would be energy that we buy in from elsewhere. So if we're buying electricity from the grid or from somewhere else, we're buying that in. We haven't created the emissions, but they do exist, and they exist because we have bought that energy. So scopes 1 and 2 are kind of our sort of direct emissions. And then basically there's everything else, which goes into scope 3. So a lot of that is around our supply chains, our commuter travel, our assets or investments, for example. And so some targets are only looking at scopes 1 and 2 because they're easier to measure, they're easier to understand, and they're easier to reduce. But one of the things around net zero, a technical definition of net zero, does include scope 3, and that's where we need to get to eventually. But it opens up a bigger question around what are we directly responsible for as organizations, as businesses, because one person's scope 3 emissions is somebody else's scope 1 and 2, because we're buying those emissions effectively from somewhere else. So that's where it starts to get a little bit complicated, but it is something that we are going to have to better understand and measure and mitigate as time goes on.
Yeah, sure. No, I think that makes sense, because I think, I've heard a few things where, our government in the country measures our emissions, but that's only the emissions that we create. And then because obviously we're an island, it doesn't factor in anything that we're, buying in from cars from China and obviously, the environmental impact that that's having. So, I guess if you're including or excluding certain things, then you come to a very different number. And I can see why, the technical definition of net zero, as you say, is including all of that, because you're just not including everything. So it's not it's a false zero then, isn't it, effectively? Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. John and Scott, from your end is, what have you, from your own businesses, is how have you found sort of scopes 1, 2 and 3, and, are you at scope 3? Sorry. So, Scott, do you want to start off on that one?
Yeah, sure. So we've been measuring our carbon emissions since 2019. 2019 would be an interesting year because it's the last year pre-COVID when emissions and data would really have been put out of kilter for at least 2 years. So we've started over 2021 and 2022 in particular to start reviewing against 2019 as our baseline. And we've grown the scope of what we've started to look at as a business. So I think, as Peter has set out, scopes 1 and 2 are much easier for us to capture and quantify with terms of energy, electricity, gas consumption across our 7 offices, and the mileage and travel associated with in-work meetings. That's all taken care of. For a business like ours, it's probably a typical challenge for a 150 strong business, 7 offices. So we've got data coming in from different sources. So the thing that we've had to do is have somebody manage that data for us individually within the business, be a center point of getting that information, and also work with an expert team from a company called Aardvark Environmental Management. And there's many businesses out there that can do this, I'm sure, that can actually capture that data and give it to you in a robust way that you're confident that it best reflects the accurate position.
Yeah.
Since 2021, we've also brought in commuting data. So scope 3 to get a better kind of reflection of exactly where we are as a business and how that makes a difference. And it actually does make a considerable difference to our carbon emissions. So around 2/3 of our emissions are scope 3 commuting related. So there's an ambition of our part to actually capture that, but also there's a compliance element to that. So the carbon reduction plans, which we're obliged to deliver as a business as part of a government framework, requires that we capture that information. So luckily we were just slightly ahead of the curve, but many businesses will have to undertake that kind of data capture in the future and look to drive down emissions on an annual basis. Yeah,
I mean, so no, thanks for that. You talk about the scopes, and you clearly got a really good understanding of those and the impact on your business, but and I think probably made it sound relatively simple, but I assume in reality it's much more difficult than that. So starting off is presumably the commuting things would have been a real challenge to get rid of.
Yes. So if you're looking to drive that down in the future, that is a challenge, and I think it's about making for your staff, wherever they may be based, options as easy as possible to decarbonise, whether that's working from home. The remote working element helps, but you are actually putting emissions onto a work from home kind of side of things as well.
Yeah.
So you're actually moving the problem on, but you are actually reducing as well through eliminating the travel. Other areas, obviously, which we've looked to put in place, and a number of businesses will do this anyway, things like cycle to work schemes where staff are hopefully able to cycle or walk into work. That can always help, and there are tax benefits to that, which will be obviously be beneficial for everyone. And then further to that, the next step on the larger version of the cycle to work is things like an EV salary sacrifice scheme, which there's a number of programs out at the moment. And that's something which we haven't implemented, but we're in the process of reviewing it and about to start. So I know a number of businesses are looking into that as well. So when people are looking to make that change from their diesel or petrol engine car, and they have the opportunity again to be tax efficient and get an electric vehicle, that might be the tipping point that would make a difference. And from the the research that we've done and the data we've got, those kind of things, when over time, will make a huge difference to our carbon emissions.
Yeah, no, thanks, Scott. That's something that we've introduced at Francis Clark as a salary sacrifice for electric vehicles. It's only been a couple of months, so just seeing the uptake on that. But it's from a personal point of view. You go, brilliant. I can get a car that I would really like for a lot less money. But also the more important thing is that it does end up being really useful for the environment in general, and also for the business and meeting the criteria of various different accreditations and making the move through the sustainability journey. So no, that's brilliant. Thanks, Scott. So just the next thing would just be useful to understand is when you started on your journeys, John and Scott, is just looking at measurement of emissions. So John, when you sort of started out, is presumably it was very, very difficult to find where you should start, how you measure the impact that you're currently having on the environment. So do you just want to sort of start off and just say how you started looking at measurement of emissions?
Yeah, so I mean, taking right back to the beginning, which wasn't that long ago, although it seems like it. I guess really it's an educational piece for us to understand where the carbon was coming from in the first place, how carbon is generated, or the impact is generated by our business. And then understanding what it is we need to measure in order to then plan to reduce it. So I mean, one of the key things really is the kind of transport emissions, and kind of interestingly, we're coming now to the end of the second year where we'll be able to compare this year to last year. And my guess is that the emissions will actually be up this year because we've come out of COVID, people are traveling around more, go to more face-to-face meetings, etc. But whilst we encourage using public transport wherever possible, the reality is we cover a large area, largely sort of rural area, where it's just not practical to get public transport. So car usage will have been up. But I think we need to obviously treat, I guess, the pandemic as a bit of an outlier in that respect. And I think I guess kind of a temporary benefit was the fact that the carbon impact was very much suppressed. But it's that bit now about how we plan to reduce it. So I mean, one of our key stakeholders is Triodos Bank, who obviously very much focused on sustainability, and they've assisted us with some of the carbon impact tools that they use for measuring carbon impact, for use of and monitoring transport, and by different types of transport, etc., and breaking it down in terms of what the impact looks like. So that's been very useful for us. But there are tools out there. We're also signatories to the SME climate commitment. So that means if anybody's not had a look at it this yet, I'd recommend they do, because there are resources on there, including carbon measurement tools. So there are resources out there for businesses.
Yeah, thanks, John. Scott, from your end, anything to add on to what John's been saying?
In terms of travel and those kind of emissions, really, I suppose one of the best things that we've done over the last few years, and this was certainly pre-COVID, and probably an early adopter in this sense, was around electric vehicle pool cars. Mm-hmm. So we had those across a number of different offices. So in Truro, and as John was saying, being a remote rural area, a lot of 30, 40 mile trips. We had a series of 2 or 3 BMW i3s that we've got over the Plymouth and Truro office, for instance. And that's saved us money. It's been better for staff. It's certainly a lot better for the environment. So things like that, actually, they're wins all round. And hopefully that can be proofs in the pudding. We've done it and tried it, and we'll only go further in that respect. So I'd urge people to look into that if they're looking at pool cars. Yeah,
I mean, that's a really good point on pool cars. And just from a tax perspective is, buy an electric vehicle for a business, obviously there's tax incentives to do that. And if you have a pool car, providing it's, you exclude sort of private use and kept at a place of business overnight, is, there is no benefit to employees. And it must be quite nice that they can turn up to work, whether it be in their own car or public travel or anything like that. And then, take a car which isn't theirs, not at their expense, and travel to a different office in a green way. So no, that sounds really good. Yeah. Peter, from your end, have you got any sort of top tips of measuring from what you're seeing from your sort of line of work?
I think, as John mentioned, some of the free tools that are out there are a really good place to start. It's tricky because I completely agree with what Scott's saying about commuter travel, and that's not an uncommon experience. Is that actually looks like that's the majority. One of the challenges with Scope 3 is the more you measure, the more you find, and it can seem like your footprint is growing. It's not, because it's there in the first place. It's just maybe a bit invisible. So yes, we need to look at commuter travel, but also water, waste, all of these other things that create emissions and that we are responsible for. So I'd say it's a case of starting where you can, and certainly looking at what do we have data for already. You probably got data on the energy that you use, the heating, the company travel. Maybe you can get data on commuter use. Maybe you can get data on water use and waste. And there are, there's data out there. You can apply a carbon cost to those things. I would say the key thing for me is to not be disheartened about it. That no one's got their head around it completely yet. A lot of us are still learning. But the key thing to remember is the point of this is to get our emissions down as low as possible. That's the main thing. It's not necessarily to demonstrate the biggest impact from our baseline to our target now, or where we've got to. We are going to have to do this all at some point, but don't worry about trying to understand everything now. It's overwhelming to everybody, but do what you can now, and then over time, tools will be improved, technology will be improved. It will be easier to do this. So it's that case of just building it in, and maybe focus on the areas where there's co-benefits. Scott talked about commuter travel, and Mitch has got a great example in the chat around reducing travel that also has co-benefits around employee well-being and health. Similar with water reduction and waste reduction, there's direct cost benefits to those as well. So it's focus on the things where there are clear cost benefits that build the resilience of your organization, and then over time, the more complicated and complex areas will become easier.
Yeah, I think it's important, isn't it? You have to start off measuring, obviously, to get an idea of where you are, and obviously there's different levels and things. But once you've got an idea of what you're emitting or what your emissions are, is the point in where you can start reducing it, isn't it? So, and I think sort of as you're saying, Peter, is even if you do a small thing, it's a small thing that you weren't doing, which is going to have a benefit. And if everyone that's on this call does a small thing collectively, that's going to make a big difference, and globally that's going to make a big difference as well. So expanding on it, once you've done that one thing, sort of mastered that and understand it, then you can move it on to the next thing, can't you? So talking about sorry,
so just to add, the worst thing I've ever heard from a business that I will absolutely not name is they were actively not taking any action to reduce their emissions until they'd done their baseline, because they wanted to demonstrate the biggest decrease from, they wanted a big baseline so they could show that they cut the most amount, which I understand, if it's from an abstract perspective, but it completely misses the point of why we're doing this in the first place. This is something we all have to do. And so it's that really, it's remembering that and not getting too caught up on the percentage or the numbers, or making it seem like you've done the best thing. Yes, there are lots of ways to communicate this, but it's at the core of it is remember why we're doing this thing in the first place. I
mean, I was going to say that there's no medals for coming first. There probably are medals for coming first in a country or in a certain sector, but that that isn't the point at all. As it is, as I said, collectively, if you're doing something, even if you're not demonstrating the biggest impact, then that is the most important thing, isn't it? So talking about measurement, the next thing to talk about really is reduction, and thinking of the ways that what was the easiest way that you could see, or you've come across in your journeys, John and Scott, that you can reduce things? I know we've sort of crossed paths with measurement and reduction slightly with the commuting, but outside of commuting, anything really easy that you can just say, if you were a new business coming along wanting to make a difference, that you can just say day one, do this, and it will make a big difference. So John, back to you.
So we started off with just looking at really small things, and it was really kind of baby steps.
Yeah.
Like looking at, what don't we need here? And, one thing was the water cooler, which was on 24 hours a day. We don't need a water cooler, there's water in the tap. So, sorry to the water cooler company, but we cancelled that contract, and just little things like that. And obviously, key thing, beware of energy usage and just making sure you're not using energy when you don't need it. Quite obvious things that perhaps you might be more likely to think about at home than in the workplace. But introducing those principles of energy saving, which actually ultimately, of course, save money for your business, which is just common sense, but stuff you might not previously have thought about. And then obviously the transport and, just introducing his policy as far as you can, sort of use public transport. A train is 70% less carbon than a car journey on average, and you can do more stuff on a train than you can do in the car,
Yeah, absolutely.
So there are productivity advantages, even if that journey might take a little bit longer, you can make that time more productive. So just little things like that, really, and trying to think laterally and mapping it all out in a plan. So the key thing is just to make a start, though, really. And I think Peter's key word that I picked out was trajectory. Just set yourselves on a trajectory so you can work towards it. There's no magic formula, and some of this stuff hasn't been worked out yet. The biggest challenge for us is scope 3, because as a finance company, the onward impact is the businesses that we invest in, and how we go about measuring and monitoring what they're doing is a huge challenge. But ultimately, that's something we are going to need to do, and part of that is obviously supporting our customers on the journey as well.
Yeah. So just on actually, coming back to scope 3, just out of curiosity, so are we talking, emissions of those that you're dealing with upward, and then emissions that you're dealing with downwards as well? So, is that sort of, call it vetting those that you're dealing with to make sure that they're not having a negative impact on the environment?
Not so much vetting at this stage. It's more kind of measuring and monitoring. And from there, and in time, this will be an annual audit process. In the same way that you'll ask for annual accounts from a business, you'll be asking for their annual carbon report. That will come in the next couple of years, and people will be expected to do this. But having said that, we're learning ourselves. So. I think the important thing is just to make a start. Don't be intimidated. Just get on with it, really. Yeah.
For some of the much larger companies, there already is a requirement to report carbon emissions in their sort of strategic report in their accounts. So for those sorts of businesses who are of that scale, is they're having to measure the emissions of travel and things, quantifying that into CO2 output and really report on it. So, and that. I think the important thing is that's publicly available, because those accounts will be published and anyone can go and have a look at it. So, if you're a prospective investor or a customer of that company, then you can go and have a look and see what their impact is, and have they been doing anything over the previous few years. So, it is something that's being introduced, and obviously it'll probably flow down to different sized entities moving forward, won't it? So that's really, really useful. Scott, anything to add on to John's in terms of reduction and easy wins?
I think over time we've done a lot of those easier wins, I suppose, and that's been an iterative process. So things like LED lighting, renewable tariffs, where you've got tariffs and encouraging landlords to go down those routes. I think we don't own our premises, so a landlord influence is really important. But as John mentioned, there's going to be kind of obligations coming in the future for landlords themselves to make sure standards are in place. So hopefully that's a win-win on both sides. One of the things we've done and are rolling out in a much more meaningful way this year is carbon literacy across our full staff cohort across the whole business. So we're working with ecology. So as well as doing the mapping of our emissions with external consultants, then looking at a really verifiable offset program where those are kind of science-based targets, gold standard. As part of that package, ecology will do a program of continuing and professional development across our team, just to get people aware. Because I think one of the things in this area of work over the last few years is that it's almost been deliberately made complex, and there's something around trying to sell a service. people are trying to sell us something that they feel will answer our questions, and it may well do, but actually keeping it simple, and some of the tools that, like John mentioned, the SME client commitment, and the one that we've been made aware of recently is NatWest. If you're a NatWest customer, there's a carbon tracker, and actually they're really intuitive, accessible documents or web portals that you can make a huge amount of ground up in an hour of spending time around the computer. So actually it should be demystified a little bit now. And another interesting one, which we've been made aware of recently that we're about to look into as well, you may be aware when booking your business travel, you probably go to the trainline.com or unfortunately an airline perhaps, or booking.com. The likes of booking.com make 22% margin on doing very little. They're a go-between. They're a middleman in that process. They've got the web tool.
Yeah.
There's a company called Coco that we're looking at potentially signing up to. Now, Coco make that same 22% margin, but they give you a list of the most carbon efficient routes to get to your end destination. They always prioritize, as John was referencing, kind of rail over air, certainly, if you're doing UK-based travel. And in that 22%, they actually put a proportion of that profit into offsetting the full carbon cost of that journey. So straight away, you're not paying any more for it. Your staff will probably enjoy that more because it's ethically, it feels right for traveling for business or staying in accommodation for business. So it feels to us like an easy win. So that's the kind of things that we're looking at this year.
Yeah, sounds brilliant. Anything else to add from your end, Peter, from an outside perspective of business effectively?
Completely agree with what's been said, and energy demand is a big area where you can get quick wins. For me, one of the biggest areas, if you really want to make a difference, is looking at where your money is going, following on what John was saying. What bank do you use? What are you investing in? Where is your pension fund? If you are putting money into a company that creates or administers fossil fuels, for example, that impact of that money will likely dwarf the carbon impact of everything else that you're doing. Obviously, it's complex and it's not necessarily an easy thing to change, but for big and quick wins, there is something that is worth looking into at least. And it's also something you can talk about in terms of your environmental responsibility, talk about with your clients and customers. And there's a growing movement around divestment from fossil fuel industries and fossil fuel companies. But I acknowledge it's complex, it's not easy, but there's more and more advice and support out there for that kind of work. Yeah,
okay, that sounds brilliant. We've talked about measurement, reduction, top tips, all the things that sound as if they've gone really well for John and Scott. What about things that haven't gone so well? Is there anything, if you could rewind, that you'd say, no, we would do this differently? Scott, back to you.
I think I'm kind of an angry optimist in life generally. You want to get things done quick, and because there's solutions out there and there's ways of making things happen. I think any big picture change and transformation like this just takes time, and there's the behavioral element to it. I think that's one of the key things. And I think part of that is around that rabbit in the headlights approach, because things have been made too technical when they don't really need to be. But I think so that's been a slight struggle when you want to get things done in 2 months, but actually it might take 6 or 12. But I think progress along the way, as Peter was really setting out, if you make meaningful steps and your intentions are to go that direction, I think you got to celebrate the wins along the way. So we've got more to do, certainly. And actually, there's a great little note there in the comments section from Kerry about Ecosia. We've started rolling that out across our business as well. Every time you search, you plant trees. It's fantastic. Why not? What that doesn't make any difference for us as Google. So, yeah, I particularly like those kind of ideas being rolled out.
Yeah, brilliant. That's good to hear, John. Anything you would have done differently, or is it just it's just a learning curve?
I'm just writing down a Ecosia search engine, so I'll start using that. I'd come back to this. The hardest thing was really getting going. I feel now we're a bit late off the mark, really, because it's like getting into the water or making yourself go for a run. The hardest thing is actually starting. And it's a bit intimidating, I think, at first, because you feel as if you need to be a scientist and understand all this stuff. And the best thing I did was during lockdown, I attended some master classes run by Greenworks in Cornwall, hosted by the Chamber of Commerce. And actually, they explained it really well. It kind of demystified everything for me, and made me really starting to think more clearly about the whole issue, really, for the first time, rather than thinking this is something I ought to be doing, but I'm not sure how. And then it's actually making that start. So I think we've got to grips certainly in terms of identifying and measuring at least our scope 1 and 2. It's scope 3, which is the real challenge really for us next. I'm not saying it hasn't worked well, but it hasn't really, we're at a very early stage with it.
Yeah, sounds good. And what about, do you think the accreditations, B Corp, do you think that makes a difference, as in, it gives you something to strive for, to aim for, or do you think it sets limits? It'd be just interesting to hear thoughts on that.
So the B Corp side of things, B Corp is a fantastic framework for taking in the full breadth of sustainability, the full kind of ESG, which is the kind of the common buzzword for now, isn't it? Environmental, social, and governance. It really does take into consideration all of those aspects. So that's a real positive point about B Corp. It doesn't major on carbon reduction in itself. There's about 200 questions in B Corp in the impact assessment, and about 4 or 5 of those will be focused on operational carbon reduction, which are really important ones, but they're not the be all and end all. So that's a full breadth of sustainability. And then your own carbon reduction plan is probably separate to that.
Yeah. Peter, what's your thoughts on B Corp and accreditations?
I mean, Scott's the expert on B Corp here, but I completely agree. I think it can be really useful, and there's something around that peer support as well, of being part of a group of people who are going on this journey together. I think, as Scott and John have both pointed out, there are a lot of challenges in where do we start. It can be really overwhelming. So I think acknowledging that and not feeling like you have to take responsibility for everything, you have to understand everything, because the data, the science is constantly changing. We're constantly learning more. It's impossible for anyone to keep up. But there are these organizations and networks that can really help people. Right, okay, this is what you need to know, and here's where you can find more information. Here are some free tools you can access. So I would really encourage people to explore those as well, especially when it's looking beyond just carbon as well. And something like B Corp, I think, is a really good example of that. Is looking at the whole deep design of an organization. And there are other models around donor economics as well that can be really helpful for an organization. And I think we'll see more of those emerging in the years ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I suppose, so we've talked about, the journey, all those sorts of things, and getting to a point, John and Scott, you've made really good progress with that. So, have you got any advice, thoughts for a business who, is at a similar stage to yours, and, you're almost thinking, well, what's next? How we've done all the easy wins, we've perhaps done not so easy wins, you've possibly come into a point which means it's quite a lot more difficult. From your side of things, how have you managed to sort of push forward and yet coming back to that word trajectory that Peter said, how have you managed to continue on that, now and thinking about it for the future?
I think from our side, we're only at the very early stage of this still. I think there's a long way to go. There's a lot of evolving opportunities that we can always make use of, and things always come up. And the B Corp network effectively is great for those kind of ideas. But I would say the Southwest is very good at a networked kind of business community anyway. So, we're very good at sharing those ideas and opportunities. So, I mean, some of them on the chat just now, about 50 pence a mile for sustainable transport routes into work. Fantastic. We could look into that. So there's way more we can do. And perhaps after John's updated, it'd be great to pick up on Andrew's point there in the comments about construction footprint and carbon. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, no, it sounds good. John, from your end, how are you keeping going, pushing forward?
As Scott was saying, I think sort of finding we're not B Corp ourselves, but we are part of a network of CDFIs who work together on this stuff. I think the important thing really is to take advice. There's plenty of free advice out there as well. And in terms of, I guess, sustaining momentum, we've got a net zero working group which meets once a quarter, so we can review progress against our timeline. and just to keep, key thing for us also is just identifying a member of the team who's our sustainability champion, much like you are, Kieran, in Francis Clark.
Yeah.
And he's basically keeper of our timeline and keeps it updated, and then we can track that every quarter and then report back to our board. So having a structure in place, I think, is important.
Thanks, that's really useful. Just conscious of time, and hopefully we can answer a few questions. But finally, thoughts from us just on these sorts of things is so we've got talked about net zero. What's next after net zero? Is that the limit, or is there anything else we can do to go beyond that?
For sure. I mean, net zero is a means to an end, and where we'll need to get to is net negative, because we are going to have to be drawing more carbon out of the atmosphere on a long-term trajectory if we want the planet to be something that can sustain not only the businesses that we're all part of, but life on this planet, without wanting to sound too dramatic. So I think it's very much looking net zero. Yes, we can focus on those now, building those targets. We also, as well as the mitigation of carbon, we also really need to be thinking about adaptation, by which I mean, how do we respond to the changes that are already guaranteed and locked in? So we mentioned before around COVID, thinking back to the heat waves from last year. There are going to be more and more extreme events that will impact our ability to function as businesses, that will impact our ability to mitigate carbon as well, because certain things will become more expensive, supply chains might become more vulnerable. So there's a real importance, at the same time as reducing our emissions, is really focusing on individual and collective responsibility and resilience as organizations. And so there's a lot of data out there that can predict very clearly what the climate in specific areas of the country and the world are going to be like in 5, 10, 50 years time. And so businesses engaging with that information is going to be really useful. Again, not to take full responsibility for that, but to just be aware of, okay, well, if we're going to have more flooding or more electrical outages, things like that. And you can look at great examples from last year, in the heat wave in the UK, of hospitals which lost their power, and what that means for the infrastructure of a whole region is really important. And the more that we can start learning about these things, and again, it comes back to the idea of tap into networks, don't feel like you have to know all of this on your own, but find those networks, those places where you can get access to that information and use it when you need it. And I think it's seeing that bigger picture is going to be really important for businesses, and I'd hugely encourage that.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. I think some of the really important things are, just reading and listening to things that I've come across is, just in relation to sea levels and things. So, apparently, I believe there's enough ice on the planet to increase sea levels by 65 meters or something like that. That's a pretty scary fact, and obviously, even a small number of meters can make a real big difference. But yeah, it's pretty scary that 65 meters if there was no ice left, and obviously that's going to take hundreds of years to get there possibly. But yeah, I would currently be underwater. Many of us, or most of the world, would be underwater if that happened. And I think for the future, it's probably a pretty scary place to be in if nothing does then happen. But and this is the purpose of these webinars, conversations, and in workplaces and things, isn't it? It's just to, as we said, maybe 20 minutes or so ago, is something small can make a really big difference, and it's just drumming up awareness, making people more aware. And if everyone does something, then all of those scary figures and facts are probably not going to happen, or will happen at a much lesser extent. So that's really useful. Just looking at the questions, have we seen any that we can have a look at?
I'd like to build on a point which Andrew made there about building carbon footprint, and that is such a huge issue. That's 35 to 40% of global emissions are based around real estate emissions. So that's both the construction process and then the operation and carbon emissions in the operational phase of those real estate assets. So we've got in our sector a lot to change, really, a lot to improve upon. But I would say that there's the UK Green Building Council kind of approach, which they've now put in place about whole life net zero, is a really interesting one to look at. So if people listening want to have a look at the UK Green Building Council website, it takes on board that design phase, the construction phase and operations, and gives you tools really to drive down emissions throughout. Because all of us really, when we first come up with an idea for an investment or a project or whatever it might be in our sector, we should be saying, well, is it needed in the first place? Ideally, can there be a retrofit opportunity rather than a new build? I think if we went back 15 or 20 years, everybody's thinking about the next glass and steel large building, that kind of edifice that they want to create. That was the mindset. But I think that's gradually shifting. And I think one of the things that we're looking to put into place is whole life carbon life cycle assessments, whereby we can work across the full team, the architects, engineers, cost consultants like us, and actually take a balanced view about how simple design decisions along the way, from initial idea to cutting the ribbon and somebody coming into a building, can actually drive down emissions massively. So that's one really exciting area in our sector. And the other thing I think is going to be interesting for the kind of retrofitting of the built environment and kind of property across the UK is going to be about renewables deployment and about smart grids, and about how actually there's financial models out there that can start to do that, which takes it off the pressure off businesses themselves. And, you know, from an accountant's perspective, it's things like the annual investment allowance and making sure that people make use of that. There's 25% corporation tax coming up. You can offset a huge amount of that cost of renewables deployment, for instance, on a site through such tools as that. And there's a lot of finance looking to, as you'll know, looking to come into these. And one of the things that with business this year is actually launching a solar canopy and electric vehicle charge point product, whereby car park estates can actually be turned into mini power stations with electric vehicle charging. You can put that back into a building, and you know, it's solutions like that that are already out there, and we can start to push more and more and actually do that can make a huge impact on our collective carbon emissions in the Southwest.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. That's brilliant. Any other questions, Peter and John, that you've seen that you'd like to pick up and answer?
Yeah, there was a question from Mark in the Q&A bit a while ago about cost-based carbon factors, which for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's effectively saying, looking at scope 3 as an example of, well, here's what we're spending our money on, and every single item that we're spending our money on, we can technically apply a carbon cost to that. So if we're buying 5,000 pens, for example, what's the average carbon impact of a pen? And then let's multiply that by however many we're buying. It's a very inexact way to do it, but there are technologies, there are models you can use that can allow you to do that. So it's a really good place to start. I'd say cost-based carbon factors. So again, it's thinking about this trajectory. Maybe start there, because you can literally just get a spreadsheet that can help you to do that. And then where we want to get to beyond that is something called an activity-based carbon factor. So it's not working out the carbon of the type of thing we're buying. It's actually what's the carbon impact of the thing that we are doing. So we're buying this particular pen that is maybe has a bigger carbon footprint than another, or something. So it's much more granular, it's more detailed. We can't do it straight away, but again, that trajectory is working towards that. So that would be my encouragement with all of this, as we've said, is, you know, start where you can, use what's out there, and then just have that in mind that you're going to keep improving that over time, because the incentives and the disincentives will only increase over time as well.
Yeah, I can't recall if it's some of the conversations we may have had before this, but, you know, something that would be really useful is if, you know, it's similar to the calories. You go into a cafe or something and you say, you know, this is X number of calories. You look at it and go, I probably won't pick up that cake because it's 700 calories. It would be quite interesting. I know it's very, very difficult, and, you know, but with technology and things, you probably could get there in the future, is to say, you know, go into a shop and it says this pen has this much of an impact on the environment, and you'd go, okay, well, I'll buy the other pen. And if you're going to do that,
Brewdog do that, Kieran. So Brewdog.
Yeah, I think that maybe that's where I've got it from. Yeah.
Yeah, they actually do that but they do that for the carbon emissions of the food that you're choosing. So, you know, you do get guilted into going for a veggie burger or a chicken burger over a beef burger.
Yeah, but that would just be so useful, because as consumers, when we go into a shop or, you know, buy a car, how do we know really what the carbon footprint is? We don't. And if there was a sticker somewhere, then it would probably change, you know, almost all of our decisions, because it just is that obvious. And it's similar to you know, calories. Is unless we want to treat ourselves that sort of thing as we do, we tend to choose the lowest because it's a bit scary, the numbers that are involved. So no, I think something like that would be really useful. So yeah, it looks like we're getting to the end. If there's any more questions that we haven't yet answered, we'll have a look through the chat. We can pull those out and we can get John, Scott or Peter to have a look at those, and we can come back to you. So really, thanks for the three on the panel. It's been brilliant to talk to you, understand your businesses and, and the things that you do. And just a final bit to say is that on 18th of May, I believe, we'll be running another deep dive in relation to sustainability. That one will be on embedding sustainability into the culture of a business. So building on some of the things that we've talked about today, which is the more technical or practical things, but this will be focused on, well, how do you change staff's attitudes to say, this, I should do this, not you're telling me to do it, so therefore I need to turn off my computer. It's I want to turn off my computer. That's a simplified version of it, but exploring those sorts of things and how we can change it. Yeah. So if that's it from all of us. Thanks everyone for attending. As I say, any questions we'll follow up. And thanks a lot, and see you again soon.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.